morning. Alarmed at the idea of hearing the neighboring clock of St. Paul strike 4 within a few minutes. An hour when the sentinel was relieved and when the latter would be found asleep under the pierced roof. Staring in horror at a terrible depth, at the light of the street lanterns, the wet, black pavement, that pavement longed for yet frightful, which meant death, and which meant liberty. He asked himself whether his 3 accomplices in flight had succeeded, if they had heard him, and if they would come to his assistance. He listened. With the exception of the patrol, no one had passed through the street since he had been there. Nearly the whole of the descent of the market gardeners from Montreuil, from Charon, from Vincennes, and from Bercy to the markets was accomplished through the Rue Saint-Antoine. 4 o'clock struck. Thénardier shuddered. A few moments later, that terrified and confused uproar which follows the discovery of an escape broke forth in the prison. The sound of doors opening and shutting. The creaking of gratings on their hinges, a tumult in the guardhouse, the hoarse shouts of the turnkeys, the shock of musket butts on the pavement of the courts, reached his ears. Lights ascended and descended past the grated windows of the dormitories. A torch ran along the ridge-pole of the top story of the new building. The firemen belonging in the barracks on the right had been summoned. Their helmets, which the torch lighted up in the rain, went and came along the roofs. At the same time, Thénardier perceived in the direction of the Bastille a wan whiteness lighting up the edge of the sky in doleful wise. He was on top of a wall 10 inches wide, stretched out under the heavy rains, with 2 gulfs to right and left. Unable to stir, subject to the giddiness of a possible fall, and to the horror of a certain arrest, and his thoughts, like the pendulum of a clock, swung from one of these ideas to the other. Dead if I fall, caught if I stay. In the midst of this anguish, he suddenly saw, the street being still dark, a man who was gliding along the walls and coming from the Rue Pavée, halt in the recess above which Thénardier was, as it were, suspended. Here this man was joined by a second, who walked with the same caution, then by a third, then by a fourth. When these men were reunited, one of them lifted the latch of the gate in the fence, and all 4 entered the enclosure in which the shanty stood. They halted directly under Thénardier. These men had evidently chosen this vacant space in order that they might consult without being seen by the passers-by or by the sentinel who guards the wicket of La Force a few paces distant. It must be added, that the rain kept this sentinel blocked in his box. Thénardier, not being able to distinguish their visages, lent an ear to their words with the desperate attention of a wretch who feels himself lost. Thénardier saw something resembling a gleam of hope flash before his eyes. These men conversed in slang. The first said in a low but distinct voice, "Let's cut. What are we up to here?" The second replied, "It's raining hard enough to put out the very devil's fire. And the bobbies will be along instanter. There's a soldier on guard yonder. We shall get nabbed here." These 2 words, ICIGO and Isakai, both of which mean ICI, and which belong, the first to the slang of the barriers, the second to the slang of the temple, were flashes of light for Thénardier. By the ICIGO he recognized Brujon, who was a prowler of the barriers. By the Isakai he knew Babet, who, among his other trades, had been an old clothes broker at the temple. The antique slang of the great century is no longer spoken except in the temple, and Babet was really the only person who spoke it in all its purity. Had it not been for the Isakai, Thénardier would not have recognized him, for he had entirely changed his voice. In the meanwhile, the third man had intervened. "There's no hurry yet, let's wait a bit. How do we know that he doesn't stand in need of us?" By this, which was nothing but French, Thénardier recognized Montparnasse, who made it a point in his elegance to understand all slangs and to speak none of them. As for the fourth, he held his peace, but his huge shoulders betrayed him. Thénardier did not hesitate. It was Guelemer. Brujon replied almost impetuously but still in a low tone. What are you jabbering about? The tavern-keeper hasn't managed to cut his stick. He don't tumble to the racket, that he don't. You have to be a pretty knowing cove to tear up your shirt. Cut up your sheet to make a rope, punch holes in doors, get up false papers, make false keys, file your irons, hang out your cord, hide yourself, and disguise yourself. The old fellow hasn't managed to play it, he doesn't understand how to work the business. Babet added, still in that classical slang which was spoken by Poulala and Cartouche, and which is to the bold, new, highly colored and risky argot used by Brujon what the language of Racine is to the language of André Chénier. Your tavern-keeper must have been nabbed in the act. You have to be knowing. He's only a greenhorn. He must have let himself be taken in by a bobby, perhaps even by a sheep who played it on him as his pal. Listen, Montparnasse, do you hear those shouts in the prison? You have seen all those lights. He's recaptured, there. He'll get off with 20 years. I ain't afraid, I ain't a coward, but there ain't anything more to do, or otherwise they'd lead us a dance. Don't get mad. Come with us. Let's go drink a bottle of old wine together. One doesn't desert one's friends in a scrape, grumbled Montparnasse. I tell you he's nabbed, retorted Brujon. At the present moment, the innkeeper ain't worth a halfpenny. We can't do nothing for him. Let's be off. Every minute I think a bobby has got me in his fist. Montparnasse no longer offered more than a feeble resistance. The fact is, that these four men, with the fidelity of ruffians who never abandon each other, had prowled all night long about La Force, great as was their peril, in the hope of seeing Thénardier make his appearance on the top of some wall. But the night, which was really growing too fine, for the downpour was such as to render all the streets deserted, the cold which was overpowering them, their soaked garments, their hole-ridden shoes, the alarming noise which had just burst forth in the prison, the hours which had elapsed, the patrol which they had encountered, the hope which was vanishing, all urged them to beat a retreat. Montparnasse himself, who was, perhaps, almost Thénardier's son-in-law, yielded. A moment more, and they would be gone. Thénardier was panting on his wall like the shipwrecked sufferers of the Méduse on their raft when they beheld the vessel which had appeared in sight vanish on the horizon. He dared not call to them. A cry might be heard and ruin everything. An idea occurred to him, a last idea, a flash of inspiration. He drew from his pocket the end of Brujon's rope, which he had detached from the chimney of the new building, and flung it into the space enclosed by the fence. This rope fell at their feet. A widow, 37, said Babet. My Tortoise. 38, said Brujon. The tavern-keeper is there, said Montparnasse. They raised their eyes. Thénardier thrust out his head a very little. Quick, said Montparnasse, have you the other end of the rope, Brujon? Yes. Knot the two pieces together, we'll fling him the rope, he can fasten it to the wall, and he'll have enough of it to get down with. Thénardier ran the risk, and spoke. I am paralyzed with cold. We'll warm you up. I can't budge. Let yourself slide, we'll catch you. My hands are benumbed. Only fasten the rope to the wall. I can't. Then one of us must climb up, said Montparnasse. 3 stories, ejaculated Brujon. An ancient plaster flue, which had served for a stove that had been used in the shanty in former times, ran along the wall and mounted almost to the very spot where they could see Thénardier. This flue, then much damaged and full of cracks, has since fallen, but the marks of it are still visible. It was very narrow. One might get up by the help of that, said Montparnasse. By that flue, exclaimed Babet. A grown-up cove, never. It would take a brat. A brat must be got, resumed Brujon. Where are we to find a young, said Guelemer. Wait, said Montparnasse. I've got the very article. He opened the gate of the fence very softly, made sure that no one was passing along the street, stepped out cautiously, shut the gate behind him, and set off at a run in the direction of the Bastille. 7 or 8 minutes elapsed, 8,000 centuries to Thénardier. Babet, Brujon, and Guelemer did not open their lips. At last the gate opened once more, and Montparnasse appeared, breathless, and followed by Gavroche. The rain still rendered the street completely deserted. Little Gavroche entered the enclosure and gazed at the forms of these ruffians with a tranquil air. The water was dripping from his hair. Guelemer addressed him. Are you a man, young, Gavroche shrugged his shoulders, and replied. A young, like me's a man, and men like you are babes. The brats' tongues well hung, exclaimed Babet. The Paris brat ain't made of straw, added Brujon. What do you want? Asked Gavroche. Montparnasse answered. Climb up that flue. With this rope, said Babet. And fasten it, continued Brujon. To the top of the wall, went on Babet. To the crossbar of the window, added Brujon. And then, said Gavroche. There, said Guelemer. The gamin examined the rope, the flue, the wall, the windows, and made that indescribable and disdainful noise with his lips which signifies. Is that all? There's a man up there whom you are to save, resumed Montparnasse. Will you? Began Brujon again. Greenhorn, replied the lad, as though the question appeared a most unprecedented one to him. And he took off his shoes. Guelemer seized Gavroche by one arm, set him on the roof of the shanty, whose worm-eaten planks bent beneath the urchin's weight, and handed him the rope which Brujon had knotted together during Montparnasse's absence. The gamin directed his steps towards the flue, which it was easy to enter, thanks to a large crack which touched the roof. At the moment when he was on the point of ascending, Thénardier, who saw life and safety approaching, bent over the edge of the wall. The first light of dawn struck white upon his brow dripping with sweat, upon his livid cheekbones, his sharp and savage nose, his bristling grey beard, and Gavroche recognized him. Hello. It's my father. Oh, that won't hinder. And taking the rope in his teeth, he resolutely began the ascent. He reached the summit of the hut, bestrode the old wall as though it had been a horse, and knotted the rope firmly to the upper crossbar of the window. A moment later, Thénardier was in the street. As soon as he touched the pavement, as soon as he found himself out of danger, he was no longer either weary, or chilled or trembling. The terrible things from which he had escaped vanished like smoke. All that strange and ferocious mind awoke once more, and stood erect and free, ready to march onward. These were this man's first words. Now, whom are we to eat? It is useless to explain the sense of this frightfully transparent remark, which signifies both to kill, to assassinate, and to plunder. To eat, true sense. To devour. Let's get well into a corner, said Brujon. Let's settle it in 3 words, and part at once. There was an affair that promised well in the Rue Plumet, a deserted street, an isolated house, an old rotten gate on a garden, and lone women. Well, why not? Demanded Thénardier. Your girl, Éponine, went to see about the matter, replied Babet. And she brought a biscuit to Magnon, added Guelemer. Nothing to be made there. The girl's no fool, said Thénardier. Still, it must be seen to. Yes, said Brujon, it must be looked up. In the meanwhile, none of the men seemed to see Gavroche, who, during this colloquy, had seated himself on one of the fence posts. He waited a few moments, thinking that perhaps his father would turn towards him. Then he put on his shoes again, and said, "Is that all? You don't want any more, my men? Now you're out of your scrape. I'm off. I must go and get my brats out of bed." And off he went. The 5 men emerged, one after another, from the enclosure. When Gavroche had disappeared at the corner of the Rue des Ballets, Babet took Thénardier aside. "Did you take a good look at that young un?" he asked. "What young un? The one who climbed the wall and carried you the rope?" "Not particularly." "Well, I don't know, but it strikes me that it was your son." "Bah!" said Thénardier. "Do you think so?"